So to get our day started, it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who I was fortunate to meet about a month ago in Scotts Bluff as part of a listening tour. Walter is just 6 months into his tenure at Buffett Early Childhood Institute, and we're so grateful that he's already invested and made a commitment to listening to and learning from diverse Nebraska communities throughout the state. I'm excited to introduce him to all of you today. Dr. Gilliam is the executive director of the Buffett Early Childhood Institute. He holds the Richard D. Holland Presidential Chair in Early Childhood Development and a primary academic appointment at the Monroe Meyer Institute at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and at a rank of tenured professor. He came to the Institute this year in 2023 from Yale University, where he was the Elizabeth Mears and House Jameson Professor of Child Psychiatry and Psychology at the Yale Child Student Center and Director of Yale's Edward Ziegler Center in Child Development and Social Policy. He's the Vice President of 0 to 3, a past President of Child Care Awareness of America, Board Treasurer for the Irving Harris Foundation, a director for First Children's Finance, All Our Kin, and the National Workforce Registry Alliance, a senior fellow with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and a former senior advisor to the National Association for the Education of Young Children. Please help me welcome Dr. Walter Gilliam to the stage and to Nebraska.
That was so lovely. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. You know, many Nebraskans needed two things to be able to get to work today. They needed a road to drive on to get here to work, and they also needed childcare, somebody to take care of their children. Two things, roads and childcare, core infrastructures for any kind of a business to be able to thrive, for any kind of an economy to be able to thrive. What is an infrastructure? Typically, an infrastructure is something that's absolutely needed in order for other things to be able to work, but the individual likely could not afford to pay for the full cost on their own. It would be completely impractical for every Nebraskan to build their own road to be able to get to work, right? We can all agree on that. And at the same time, for many people, they can't find access to child care, and if they can't find access to child care, it might be unaffordable to them. And they can't afford to pay more, and the child care providers can't afford to make less money. And so as a result, that's the definition essentially of a core infrastructure. Something that's needed in order for other things to work, like an economy, and at the same time the market itself alone may not be able to solve the issue. Core infrastructure, roads, and child care. So when I think about some of the beneficiaries of child care, some of the beneficiaries of child care are employers that need child care in order to be able to know that their employees can come to work today, working families who need child care in order to actually be able to go to work and to feel comfortable that somebody's taking care of their child, will keep their child safe. Another beneficiary is, of course, the young children themselves. And if we do it right, then child care can be educational and can be a benefit to children's development. One of the things that I know for a fact is this: no state has enough money that they can invest in child care that is not educational, or early education that does not provide enough hours to actually be viable child care. You need to be able to do both of those together in order to actually have an efficient system. And then the fourth beneficiary is the early educator themselves. Before the pandemic, 1.1 million Americans claimed child care or early education as their employment. That's what they did. That was their job. This is a workforce that in and of itself is of value. Many Nebraskans are employed in the early care and education workforce. And this much I know for a fact. Every penny we pay an early educator gets spent immediately and locally within their community. I know an awful lot of early educators, but I've never met one that takes their paycheck and invests it in offshore investments. That does not happen. People, when they're in the early care and education field, they spend that money immediately and locally right there where they are. Now, I appreciate the applause, but I also did notice that there are emojis sitting at your table. So if you would like, please feel free to throw up an emoji, if you want to thumbs up something. So let me go forward with some of these beneficiaries and describe them a little bit. In terms of employers needing child care, there's about 1 million, a little bit more than 1 million Nebraskans who are in the labor force today. That's based on 2022 American Community Survey data. About 102,000 have young children and every single adult in their home is employed. In other words, 102,000 that absolutely had to have somebody to care for the children in order for them to go to work. 102,000 Nebraskans that had to have some form of child care. Now that could be familial care in the form of grandma and grandpa, but they had to have somebody that could provide that child care or they would not have been able to go to work. 73% of all Nebraskans with young children need to have some form of child care because all of the adults in that home are employed. And 10% of all working Nebraskans, 10% of the entire Nebraska labor force has young children at home and no one to care for them without child care. 10% of the entire labor force is a huge sector of the labor force to rely on one particular thing. And once you get to the 10%, now you're talking about a core infrastructure. Without that infrastructure, that 10% cannot go to work. And Nebraska is just not a big enough state to afford to lose 10% of its employees. Another thing that we know, in terms of working families needing child care themselves. Now, we know the employers need the child care, working families need the child care. 76% of Nebraskan mothers of young children are in the labor force. 76%. That's a lot. 3/4 of all of the working mothers, 3/4 of all of the mothers of infants and toddlers are employed in this state. 70% of Nebraskan mothers of infants and toddlers are in the labor force. We're talking about babies. Mothers with babies who are employed in the labor force, and someone has to take care of the child. You cannot latchkey a baby. 72% of young children live in homes where all the adults work, and the national average is 67%. In other words, Nebraskans work, but in order for them to be able to work, they have to have child care in order for that work to be able to happen. 91% of Nebraska counties, however, this is the flip side. This is the part that Governor Pillen was talking about earlier, about how maybe everything is not always absolutely perfect. 91% of Nebraska counties do not have enough child care to be able to support what I just said. And 11 counties have no licensed child care at all, right here in this state. And that's why we at the Buffett Early Childhood Institute have been going around the state to try to understand what that need is like. It's one thing to have data, it's another thing to have stories, and I'll have a few stories for you later on as I talk. Nebraskans have left employment because they couldn't find affordable child care. We know that for a fact. 31% of Nebraskan parents of young children have reported leaving the workforce because they couldn't find child care. 31%, nearly a third of Nebraskan families with young children have had to quit their employment because they couldn't find child care. Almost a quarter of all Nebraskan parents, regardless of the age of the children, have had to quit employment because they couldn't find somebody to take care of their children. Now, there's about 80,000 unfilled jobs in Nebraska. And so when you put all of that together, you can see where the crisis is. And there was a study that was done just before the pandemic at University of Nebraska-Lincoln that estimated the total loss in revenue for the state is $745 million per year simply and solely because of a lack of child care. That's a lot of money. We're talking about employment, we're talking about opportunity, we're talking about economics when we're talking about child care. But we also know this, young children need high quality early care and education programs themselves in order for them to be able to thrive and to flourish. Early childhood programs set a support for children in terms of their lifelong development. The things that happen in their early years are important for how they're going to be spending the rest of their life. Something else that we know for a fact too, Governor Pillen touched on this, the family is the first teacher. However, in many cases, the family also needs a paid caregiver in order to be able to augment that family. And so we're not talking about child care instead of parents, we're talking about child care with parents. as a support system for parents to be able to also be able to work and be able to be effective parents and take care of their children. Early learning is based in relationships. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And also high quality early care and education programs we know have lasting impacts in the lives of children. So let me take on each one of those separately. The first few years of life tend to set the foundation for all later development that can happen. Now, there was a study that was done a few years ago looking specifically at children who have been severely neglected because their parents weren't available and because they were in low quality, poorly subsidized childcare in the form of remaining in orphanages. Now, their parents weren't available, they were orphans, they were in a care facility, an orphanage, and as a result, they weren't necessarily in that particular setting getting the level of stimulation necessary in order for them to be able to thrive. And so this one researcher came in and started doing brain imaging of the children who were in the orphanages and compared them to other typical peers within their community. And you can see here on the left, a brain scan of a child who was in the community, having normal, typical relationships with a loving family. And then you can see on the right the result of extreme neglect. I don't have to point out the differences. You can see it in terms of the size of the head. You can see it in terms of the size of the dark spots. Those are the ventricles. Very little gray matter on the right compared to the left. Take a look at this slide. There's two things happening in babies when they're born: proliferation and pruning. Babies are born with about 100 billion brain cells. That's more than the number of estimated stars in the Milky Way galaxy inside of their brain. And when they're developing, something's happening. Lots of connections are being made between these brain cells in order to allow them to be able to do complicated things, like think about what they're going to say next, actually control their tongue, their mouth to be able to make those words happen. That all takes connections that have to be able to be formed in order for the child to be able to learn how to do these complicated things. Now, if you look at these slides, at the newborn, you can see some synaptic connections. You see those lines, and they're connecting, and then at 1 month, 9 months, 2 years, you can see how much more connections there are. Do you see the difference between 2 years and adult? What do you notice? Anything? Do you notice that in the adult, fewer connections, but the ones that survived are actually stronger? That's because something else is happening in addition to the connections, and that's the pruning. When a connection isn't used, it isn't reinforced in the environment, it drops away. It disconnects, literally, so that the brain can form other connections instead. So when we don't talk to a young child, as a result, those connections drop away. And then they start forming different connections because the brain is really good at knowing what it needs in order to survive in the environment it's in, but it does not know what it needs in order to be able to survive in the environment it's going to be in when it gets to kindergarten. And so as a result, the brain adapts. Now, when I think about the second one, family is the most important teacher for a child. Children come pre-wired for relationships with adults. Let's take, for instance, a baby. Baby is born, baby is here. Let's say the baby is about 4 or 5 days old. And I show two pictures to the baby. And the baby could turn their head towards one or the other. And let's say one picture is a picture of a face. And the other one is a picture of a car. Which one will the baby turn their head towards? The face, yes. Now, let's say one is a picture of a face, and the other is a picture of a Bentley. Which one now? Still the face, yes, still the face. What if I show two pictures to a child, and one of them is a picture of a circle, and the other one is a picture of a square? Circle. What if one picture is a circle, and the other one's a picture of an oblong? Circle. The one that looks the most like a face. They come out wired to seek out faces. And when babies are born, mothers typically get a boost of oxytocin. You've heard of oxytocin. It's the cuddle hormone, causes you to want to cuddle with that baby. A lot of people know about oxytocin. A lot of people might not know this. Fathers get a spike of oxytocin too, if they were there to see the birth of the baby. Because ultimately, babies are born wired to seek out human relationships, and in the process of birthing, we adults become wired to reciprocate that. Basically, we are meant to be caring for young children, not leaving them without care. When a baby's born, they typically have a vision of about 7 to 12 inches. Anything closer to 7 inches, they can't see very well. Anything past about 12 inches, they can't see very well. In other words, the distance of about that. That's the distance that a baby can actually see. That's where their world is. And that's why it's important to be able to have things like paid parental leave, so that parents can actually be at home and take care of their young children. Children learn through relationships. I'll give you an example of that in terms of language. How many people have a young child in their home, or they've ever known a young child? How many people have ever been a young child? So you might be able to remember what I'm getting ready to describe. So it's like, do you remember oh, I'm going to need to have somebody to stand in the place of a parent for me. Faith, can you do that? All you have to do is just be right there, and you're going to be my line of sight. You're mom, and right there is like a glass of milk, and the baby wants the milk, and the baby goes, and they're trying to reach the milk. And what would you do? You would go get it, and you would give it to me, because not doing that is cruel. so you would go get the milk, and you would give me the milk, and then that's Monday. And on Tuesday, and then what would you do? Same thing. And then on Wednesday, and then what would you do? Same thing again. And then on Thursday, you see the baby do this. Looking right at you. That happens at around 8, 9, 10 months old typically. That is the beginning of communicative intent. That is the beginning of actual language. When a baby sees that I can use some kind of gesture, and then eventually maybe the word milk, maybe the word drink, and I can tell you something and you'll actually, but that doesn't happen without all the other days before when you were getting that milk for me. Babies learn language within the context of human relationships. You take the human relationship out, the learning goes away, because the learning is in the context of that human relationship. High-quality early care and education can have lasting impacts in the lives of children, because high-quality early care and education programs are based in high-quality human relationships with young children. We did a study several years ago looking at state-funded pre-K programs. These are preschool programs implemented by state governments, and systematically looking across all of them, big impacts in favor of children's development, especially in the area of grade retention. Children who went to high-quality preschool programs, less likely to be retained in grades later on. There's been statewide random controlled trials or regional random controlled trials of high-quality preschool programs dating back to the 60s, where they randomly assigned children to either attend a high-quality preschool program or not attend a high-quality preschool program. And back in the 60s, in many places they didn't have any kind of an alternative, so if they were randomly assigned to not go to the preschool program, they didn't have anything else to go to. So it was a clean comparison. And in those cases, what they found was that the children who went to the high-quality preschool program, as opposed to largely sitting at home while their parents worked, those children were far more likely to not be retained in grade, far more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go to college, more likely to be employed, more likely to own a home. As a result of owning a home, they paid more taxes later on. They followed these children through life. As a result, they were more likely to pay taxes later on. And where does your property taxes go? Right back into the public schools. It paid for itself. And when people came in as economists and took a look at the amount of money that went into the program and how much societal savings went on, afterwards, as a result of that, always positive impacts in terms of societal savings by investing in early care and education if it's of high quality, which has led people like Jim Hickman, the Nobel laureate from the University of Chicago, to be able to talk about the amount of return on investment and basically show that the younger you invest in a child, the greater the amount of return of that investment. Anybody that I've ever met that talks about investments, whether it's stock or whatever, they say the secret is get in early, right? Find a good investment, get in early. I'll tell you what the good investment is. Our children, Nebraskan children, get in early. So I'm going to stop right here and tell you a little story that I like to throw into these things. I was getting ready to, this was back in 2015, go testify for the House Appropriations Committee, and I was in Connecticut, and I stopped off at a deli, and there was a man there that was well known in the little town that I was living in. His name is Richard Doolittle, and he was a peach tree farmer and the town horticulturist. And I didn't tell him where I was going, but I had a question for him. I said, Dr. Doolittle, because he was the town expert, and of course, if you're the expert in something and your last name is Doolittle, then, everybody's going to call you Dr. Doolittle. So I said, Dr. Doolittle, if I wanted to grow good peaches, and I took the life of a peach tree and I divided it into 3 stages. The first is when I put the seed in the ground until it sprouts. The second phase is when the sprout becomes a tree. And the third is when the tree starts to mature and give fruit. And I want to have good peaches at the end. And I could make one of those perfect, absolutely perfect. Perfect rain, perfect sun, perfect everything. The other 2, I don't know what I'm going to get, but one of them I could make perfect. Which one would you choose if you wanted good peaches at the end? And without any hesitation, he said, well, I'd pick the first one. And I said, well, why? And he said, because whatever you do for that little seed sets the potential for everything that tree can become. This is what it is that we know from the science. That's what I just told you about. If I were to take 10 years, 20 years, 50 years of developmental science and summarize it, it would be that. There's a handful of other stories I can tell you about. Let me tell you about the story of Stacy from Grand Island. I was new to Nebraska. I just gotten here. World Series was happening. And I go to the World Series and I sit down, and guess who's sitting next to me? A home-based child care provider from Grand Island, whose name is Stacy. So of course I'm talking to Stacy, and trying to learn about home-based child care there. And she tells me about the fact that she takes care of children from 6 weeks old up until about kindergarten entry. And all of the children she cares for are the children of Grand Island teachers. Every single one of them. Now, some of them are siblings. And so I said, well, how many teachers is that? And she said, well, about 7. I have 7 teachers whose children I care for. And I said, well, what would happen if you couldn't care for them? And they said, oh, they tell me all the time they wouldn't be able to go to work. And I said, so Stacy, you're telling me you're the teacher that makes 7 other teachers possible. And she said, well, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I guess I am. Now, Stacy wanted to be here today, but she can't be here today. You know why? Couldn't find a substitute. Couldn't find somebody who could actually come in and take care of her children. Now, a few weeks after that, I'm in Valentine with the team, and we're meeting with somebody named Danny, a home-based child care provider named Danny in her home in Valentine. And she recently cut back from 5 days a week to 4 days a week. You want to know why? She had young children too. And she needed to be able to take them to the doctor, to the dentist, run errands. And so she had to cut from 5 days to 4 because she needed to have child care for herself. Or she needed to have substitute teaching. She couldn't find it either. Low-hanging fruit when you think about that. When I go out to see community leaders out in the West, they talk about housing, of course. They talk about child care and the need for child care, but then they also talk about mental health. And they weave that in there all over the place. And I hear the same exact thing when I'm talking to superintendents, whether it's in Omaha or elsewhere in the state. So how well are those who care? Well, I can tell you this. They've been under a lot of stress since the beginning of the pandemic. Within 3 months of the pandemic, 35% of the entire early care and education workforce was unemployed, with periodic closures affecting the rest of them, health conditions that were affecting them, way higher than you'd expect, moderate to severe asthma rates among early care and education providers. This is from national studies that we were doing out of Yale University with about 126,000 early care and education providers all across America, about 15% of the workforce. That's a study that we began at Yale at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're porting it now to Nebraska so that we can run that study out of the Buffett Institute. Depression rates. At the beginning of the pandemic, 46% of our early care and education providers screening positive for diagnosable levels of depression. I'm not saying 46% sad every once in a while. I'm saying 46% potentially diagnosably depressed. And 18 months into the pandemic, that 46% became 56%. Depression and stress were clearly related to pay and clearly related to the stability in work hours and stability in pay. As more instability happened, the greater the level of depression and stress. How much we care for our children can be directly measured by how much we care for those who care for those children. Of that, I am positive. Our babies' cups are filled to the degree that some caregiver's cup is flowing over. That much I am positive of. And if we really care for our children, then we have to care for those who care for those children every single day. We also found that there were greater levels of mental health distress among the children in the care of these early care and education providers through the course of the pandemic. 64% of the teachers say the children in my care are more externalizing, more acting out, more aggressive. 63% of them saying they're more shy, withdrawn than before. 49% saying that their bodies are showing signs of stress in terms of difficulties sleeping, difficulties eating, difficulties regulating themselves. This is what the child care providers were reporting to us in this incredibly large national study. And yet their access to mental health consultation, mental health supports was quite low. It did increase in terms of early care and education programs that were serving predominantly children of color over the course of the pandemic, and that's a good thing. However, if I change this scale and put it on a true scale of 0 to 100%, then the real reality is this. Almost nobody's getting any of it anyway. So it got a little better, but got a little better from almost nothing to just a little bit better than almost nothing. I'm going to give you some data before I sit down and bring up the panel. This is hot off the press, or actually this is not off the press. This is actually stuff that we got from our latest wave, and I want to compare some of the things that we know about Nebraska to the rest of the nation. So I'm going to tell you this, but I have to caveat it. Look at this with some preliminary kind of grain of salt to it. We're still crunching on the numbers. We still need to weight the data. And literally, I've been trying to crunch this out over the past 4 or 5 nights because we just closed down the survey at Yale, just got the data in, okay? So this is what I can tell you. If you compare, see in the red, that's Cornhusker red for Nebraska, and blue is the United States. So you can see 86% reporting that children are more aggressive than before the pandemic nationally. That percentage is, quote, only 72% in Nebraska, but 72% is huge. The take home from this is that mental health needs in our young children are much higher than before the pandemic, maybe not quite as high as the United States on the whole. However, the rates in Nebraska are higher than the US was last year, which tells me this. It looks kind of like Nebraska is just lagging a year behind in terms of the amount of stress that's showing up in some of the ratings. Mental health supports. Nationally, 72% of the early care and education providers reported no access to mental health supports. In Nebraska, that's 82%. However, we do have programs like Holly Hattenbauer's CHIME program out of UNL, Rooted in Relationships. You all know about Rooted in Relationships here? Yes. Nebraska Children and Families Foundation, but it's not enough. We don't have enough of it. Rooted in Relationships is not in every community, but it's a good thing that we have it. Like what the governor was saying before, there's a lot of wonderful things to celebrate, but there's also a lot of work to do, too. Are you still working in the field of early care and education and intervention? So, United States, 85% of the sample said yes. In Nebraska, 87% said yes. And you can see where they've went there. In Nebraska, quite a few of them have a different job, and they went to a different job. Top reasons for leaving early care and education. So, United States, what I did was I listed the top 5 reasons there. Low pay was the number 1 reason. Number 1 also for Nebraskans. Not enough respect. Literally just do not feel respected in their job because of the work that they do. Now, you'll see that I highlighted one there. That's because it didn't show up as a top reason nationally, but it showed up as a top reason in Nebraska, and that was they needed more flexibility of hours. And the reason why was a big part of the sample that we had from Nebraska were indeed home-based child care providers, and many of them were telling us in data the exact same stories that I heard for the reason why Stacy can't be here today and why Danny had to cut back from 5 hours to 4. I smell low-hanging fruit in terms of something that we could potentially be able to do to keep people in the field of early care and education just by simply making it more possible for them to live their daily lives and take care of other people's children. Another exit survey question. These are questions that we only asked, by the way, to people who had left the field, people who had actually left the field in the course of the last year. Do you ever plan on returning to a job in early childhood care or education? Now, the good news here in Nebraska is that quite a few more, I guess 13% as opposed to 10% say that they're willing to come back, but 13% is not a lot. We've kind of lost a lot of these people. We're going to have to grow new early educators, and we're going to have to find a way to be able to retain them with the kind of pay and benefits that they deserve and the kind of pay and benefit that would keep them here. Would you recommend a career in early childhood care and education to a friend or a family member? This is a question that's often done in exit surveys for corporations. It's about reputational damage. If you're leaving my company, have I damaged my reputation as a corporation with you so badly that you would not recommend somebody else to work for us? And here you can see what the answers are. About half of them in Nebraska say yes, and most of the rest of them were not quite sure that they would really suggest that somebody go into the field of early care and education. I know that a lot of people in my line of business struggle with this because we care deeply about early care and education. But at the same time, we know you can't really make a living doing it. You better go into it for reasons of the heart because there's no reasons of the head to do it. You know, and that's just the reality of it as we've structured it today. There's a study that was done in Virginia where they have $1,500 to give away in retention bonuses. And what they found was that when they gave $1,500 away, it significantly increased the number of people who did not leave the field. In other words, the retention bonuses work, especially when they paced them out and gave $500, $500, $500, instead of making them wait until the end to get all 1,500s. Now, a lot of economists would say the way that you need to do that is you make them wait until the end, you give them all 1,500 at the end, and then they'll stay. But what they actually found in Virginia was this: you get a better retention if you give them $500, $500, $500. Why? Because it's not an incentive bonus. Incentive means something you want but you don't need. For this field, it's something that they needed in order to just be able to survive, to be able to make it through to the rest of the year. And this is what we found ultimately when we asked early educators, would you have, these are early educators who left the field, would you have stayed if we paid you $500 more to stay? And then you can see about 20% nationally said yes. And if they said no, then we said, well, what if we paid you $1,000? It went up to 29%. And if they said no, I still wouldn't stay, then we said, well, what if it was $1,500? And you can see, you can actually get a much bigger bang for the buck if you go up to about $3,000. That's what we were ultimately finding from that. Just paying people more money will cause them to be more likely to stay. And here's one last little piece of information that I'm going to tell you about. In Nebraska, early educators tend to spend more of their money out of pocket on classroom materials than the national average. However, did you know this? That there is a tax credit, an above-the-line tax credit. I bet Commissioner Maher knows this because, like me, used to be a public school teacher, I think. There's an above-the-line tax credit that you can take if you're an educator. If you are a K-12 teacher, you can claim up to $300 of expenses that you spent in your classroom and take them off of your taxes. But did you notice that I say K-12 teachers? It's eligible for guidance counselors, social workers, but not early educators, because they're written out of it. Another low-hanging fruit that we could potentially be able to change. We also know that Nebraskans know this, and we know that it's important to start thinking about how to not just admire the problem, but actually talk about how to do something about it. And so with that, I am thrilled to invite up to the stage our panelists.